everyone, this is Marika and welcome back to another session of Community Health Nursing with me. So in our previous session, we have discussed a very interesting topic which is communication, and we've seen what is communication, what is the process of communication, and what are the various types of communication as well as functions of communication. Let us quickly recall what we have studied in the last session and move on to today's topic, which is barriers of communication. So as we know, communication is the process of exchange of ideas, thoughts, beliefs, values between two or more persons. Communication is the most important thing that is needed for human beings in order to have a social life or in order to convey any kind of information. In communication, as we know, there are 5 different elements, which includes the sender, the receiver, the message channel, and a feedback. The sender is the person who sends the message, the receiver is the person who receives the message. The message is the content of communication, and then we have a channel, which is the medium that is used by the sender in order to send the message to the receiver. And finally, we have a feedback, which is the response from the receiver after receiving and decoding the message. Now, communication can be of different types, which includes verbal communication, non-verbal communication, formal communication, informal communication, one-way communication, two-way communication, upward communication, downward communication, and horizontal communication. And there are 3 major functions of communication, which is information. When we want to provide any kind of information, when we want to give out any kind of information, communication is must. We communicate in order to give out the information. The second one is for emotion expression. When we have any kind of emotion that we want to express to somebody, whether we are happy, sad, we're angry, we use communication in order to express our emotion. Communication is also used in order to motivate the people around us. Usually, communication for motivation is used by group members in order to make sure that the team members work together and motivate one another to move forward. Now that we have understood what is communication, what are the different types of communication, and what are the different functions of communication, let us see what are the barriers of communication. For any given process, when we carry out any kind of activities, it is obvious that we might encounter with some barriers. First, let us understand what is a barrier, then we will move on and study about barriers of communication. In a very simple term, barrier is something that blocks the way or causes obstruction. Now, what is barrier of communication? Anything that hinders with the process of communication can be termed as barriers of communication. Barriers of communication are those factors, are those things that causes interruption in the communication process, or any factors that makes the communication process ineffective is called as barriers of communication. Barrier of communication is anything that blocks the communication, that interrupts the communication, or we can also say certain factors which makes the communication ineffective. In the communication process, we have majorly 4 different barriers. The first one is the physiological barrier. The second one is the psychological barrier. The third one is environmental barrier. And the last one is cultural barrier. Let us see one by one what are these different barriers. The first one is a physiological barrier. Physiological barriers are those barriers which are related to the limitation of human body. Physiological barrier may occur from individuals' personal discomfort, ill health, hearing loss, or poor eyesight. When we have poor eyesight or when the person has hearing loss, it is obvious that the communication process becomes ineffective, right? So when there are any kind of physiological abnormalities in a person, then the communication cannot be very effective. Therefore, the first barrier of communication is the physiological barrier. Physiological barriers are those related to limitation of human body, such as any kind of illness, poor eyesight, as well as hearing loss of an individual. Because of the presence of all these physiological abnormalities, the person, the receiver, will not be able to understand the message the way it is sent to him. For example, if a person is having hearing loss, right? When we communicate with them, the message may not reach out appropriately to that person because of hearing loss. Physiological abnormality in a person is one of the barriers of communication. The next barrier that we have is psychological barrier. Now, sometimes an individual may be emotionally disturbed and may have the difficulty to comprehend the message that is sent by the sender. The psychological state of both the sender as well as the receiver affects the communication process. Now, if there's any kind of psychological difficulty in the sender as well as in the receiver, the message may not be effective. The communication may not be effective. If people are suffering from any kind of mental disturbances, if people have any kind of psychological problem, it affects their ability to communicate properly. Therefore, people who are involved in communication process must be mentally stable in order to ensure that the communication is effective. The third one that we have is cultural barriers. Cultural barriers occur due to the lack of similarities in the culture in different parts of the world. Now, not just in different parts of the world, even in our own country, when we talk about India, we see that there are different cultures that are followed from one region to another region, one state to another state. So therefore, there will be obviously differences in the culture that is followed by the people. Cultural barriers occur when there is differences in the culture that is followed by the people. For example, some kind of belief or behavior may be acceptable in one culture, but it may not be acceptable in another culture. Or some kind of words which is acceptable in one culture may not be acceptable in another culture. Therefore, a cultural barrier usually occurs when people of two different culture communicate with one another. When we are communicating with people of the same culture, we know about each other's culture. So there are no differences in our culture because we follow the same culture. But when we communicate with someone who follows a different culture, then there may be a chance of cultural barrier. In cultural barriers, custom, religions, belief, attitude, all of these things are included. Language variation, education, class differences, stereotype, prejudices, all are example of cultural barriers. The last one that we have is environmental barrier. What is environmental barrier? Environmental barriers are those factors which occurs in the environment but disturbs the communication process. Certain factors in the environment disturbs communication process. Environment plays a major role in communication. When we communicate in a safe environment, when we communicate in a proper environment, only then communication will be effective. If we communicate in a very noisy place where there's no proper lighting or the temperature is too high, then it is obvious that the person who is communicating will not be able to give out the message properly. So there are so many factors in the environment that affects the communication, such as time, noise, place, climate, poor lighting, and long distance. So these are all the environmental factors that affects the communication process, thereby making the communication ineffective. The best example of how environmental factors act as the barrier in communication is when we are communicating with somebody. If we are communicating on the roadside and it is very windy or rainy, then it is obvious that our communication will be affected, our communication will be interrupted. Here, the communicators, the sender as well as the receiver, will face difficulties in expressing what they want to say as well as receiving what the other person have told. Therefore, environmental factors are also one of the major barriers in communication. So that is it for today's class. In today's session, we have discussed a very short topic, which is barriers of communication, in which we've seen that barriers are anything that causes obstruction. Barriers of communication are majorly divided into 4 barriers, which includes the physiological, the psychological, the environmental, and cultural barrier. I hope the class was helpful, and I'll see you all in the next session where we will discuss about health communication. Thank you and have a great day ahead.